South Dakota History, Secrets of the Silent Plains. South Dakota. At first glance, it's a quiet stretch of plains, windswept and still. But buried beneath that silence lies a history carved by ancient hunters, betrayed treaties, hidden riches, and a sacred land that still echoes with unrest. This land, now the 40th state of the United States since November 2, 1889, is far more than a mere name on the map. South Dakota holds the geographic center of the nation, just north of Belfourche, and boasts a curious divide. Two lakes, separated by miles, flow in opposite directions. Lake Traverse, in the southeast, feeds into Hudson Bay. Big Stone Lake, meanwhile, sends its waters to the Gulf of Mexico. A quiet reminder that this state, split by the Missouri River, is a place of great contrasts, between east and west, settlers and natives, conquest and resistance. Its capital, Pierre, remains one of America's smallest, almost as if South Dakota wishes to hide its heart. Ancient echoes, before the state was born. Roughly 10,000 years ago, early people arrived here. They hunted bison across vast grasslands, leaving only whispers of their presence. Later came the Mandan and Arikara, skilled traders who wove this land into a greater web of commerce. But it was the Sioux who would come to dominate, fiercely and unmistakably, by the 1700s. Invasion of the land, exploration, gold, and conflict. In 1682, a French explorer, René-Robert Cavelier, Sieur de la Salle, set foot in what was then called Upper Louisiana. France's claim was brief. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 transferred this untamed territory to the United States. For decades, it was the fur traders who dared settle here. Not until the mid-1850s did a more determined wave of outsiders arrive, land speculators seeking fortune, and soldiers establishing Fort Randall on the Missouri River. By 1859, the settlements of Vermilion and Yankton had emerged, and in 1861, the Dakota Territory was born. But the true story of South Dakota is not in its settlements. It is in the tension. At the time, settlers numbered fewer than 1,000. The Sioux? 25,000 strong. Conflict was inevitable. From 1854 to 1890, the Sioux fought, intermittently, defiantly, against the U.S. government. Their resistance ended in tragedy at Wounded Knee, where hundreds of Lakota were massacred. It was the final act in a brutal campaign to subdue the region's original inhabitants. The Black Hills, a sacred betrayal. And yet, the war for South Dakota's soul was never truly over. In the 1870s, gold fever swept the West. The Black Hills, a sacred site to the Sioux, were overrun by prospectors. The 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie had promised this land to the Sioux, and yet, in 1877, Congress claimed it with a forced agreement. The Sioux never forgot. They sued the U.S. government in 1887. It took nearly a century, but in 1980, the Supreme Court ruled in their favor, declaring the seizure of the Black Hills illegal and awarding over $100 million in compensation. But the Sioux refused the money. To them, the land was never for sale. Not then. Not now. Even into the 21st century, they continue to demand the return of the land itself, 1.3 million acres that hold more than gold. They hold identity, memory, legacy. South Dakota History, Part 2 from Statehood to Shadows of Change. As the gold dust began to settle, a new rush took hold, one not for treasure, but for land. Between 1878 and 1887, the eastern reaches of Dakota Territory swelled with settlers. A quiet frontier was transformed. The population exploded from 80,000 to over 325,000 in less than a decade. Railroads cut across the prairie like veins, first reaching the Missouri River, then crossing the entire territory to touch the sacred Black Hills. Rapid City emerged as the threshold to the west, a city born from opportunity and ambition. But beneath this progress, a rift deepened. A line, silent yet political, was drawn at the 46th parallel. In the South, calls grew louder for a separate state. Constitutional conventions were held in 1883 and again in 1885, and from the latter, the concept of a new state, Dakota, was born. Congress hesitated, but the push for dual statehood proved relentless. In 1889, the Union answered. On the same day, North and South Dakota stepped into statehood, twin states with divided pasts and uncertain futures. Reform and reversal, populists, progressives, and power. The 1890s stirred yet another wave, this time political. The populist movement swept across South Dakota, briefly unseating the Republican stronghold. Farmers, dreamers, and disillusioned citizens clung to its promises. But as the 20th century neared, populism gave way to progressivism, another reformist force. By 1898, South Dakota made history. It became the first state in the country to adopt the referendum and initiative, tools that gave power back to the people. Citizens could now directly shape legislation, a radical idea for its time. Between 1917 and 1919, the state funded its own farm loan program, created a state hail insurance system, operated a coal mine, and built a cement plant. These were not just public works. They were declarations. Still, the boom would not last. Despair on the plains, depression and decline. By 1920, the age of settlement was over. South Dakotans scattered across isolated enclaves, small towns, farms, ranches, and reservations. By 1930, the population had climbed to 690,000. Then came the 1930s. The Great Depression did not simply touch South Dakota, it hollowed it out. Dust storms ravaged the land. Drought strangled the crops. Desperation spread. Federal aid programs like the Works Progress Administration and the Civilian Conservation Corps offered a lifeline. Others packed what little they had and left. For years, the population fell into decline. It would not rise again until after the war. The Missouri divided more than land. World War II brought with it a new kind of change. Through the Pix-Loan Plan, a series of dams were constructed along the Missouri River. These dams promised power, flood control, and irrigation. But for the native people, the cost was unbearable. Hundreds of square miles of tribal land vanished beneath reservoirs. Nearly 1,000 native families were displaced. For them, progress meant loss. And it wasn't the first time. From 1880 to 1934, Sioux spiritual life was systematically suppressed. The sun dance, a central religious rite, was outlawed. Worship with sacred pipes and peyote was driven underground. Though some ceremonies continued in secret, the pressure to assimilate was suffocating. Ironically, the New Deal of the 1930s, the very program that rescued many South Dakotans, also brought relief to the Sioux. But that support faded by the 1950s, replaced by a colder, more conservative policy shift. The programs were dismantled. The struggle returned. Only with the Great Society initiatives of the 1960s would some of those programs see revival. A legacy of contrast. By mid-century, South Dakota had fully embraced conservatism. Yet beneath its surface lay unresolved tensions, between federal ambition and tribal autonomy, between modern development and ancestral land, between memory and forgetting. This is South Dakota's history, not a tale of linear progress, but a landscape haunted by its choices, divided by rivers, stitched together by rail, and shadowed by treaties unfulfilled. The silence here is never empty. Remembers. South Dakota History, Part 3 Return to Wounded Knee. By the mid-1940s, a quiet exodus had begun. Native Americans, long confined to reservations, began leaving their ancestral lands in search of something else: jobs, education, and hope. The cities offered opportunity, or at least the promise of it. But far from home, many found only isolation and discrimination. Then came the 1960s. The country was changing, and so were its tribes. Amid rising voices for civil rights, the American Indian movement emerged, a new force demanding recognition, dignity, and sovereignty. And with it came a tide of return. Native Americans journeyed back to reservations, not just to reclaim their land, but to reignite their identity. As non-native populations slowly drifted from rural homesteads to urban centers, the reservations grew louder with purpose. And then, in 1973, history returned to a place already marked by it. Wounded Knee, a reckoning rekindled. In February of that year, armed members of the American Indian movement occupied the small village of Wounded Knee, the same site where hundreds of Lakota men, women, and children had been massacred in 1890. It was not just a protest. It was a reckoning. The occupiers demanded justice, autonomy, and an end to government neglect. Federal marshals surrounded the village. For 71 tense days, a siege unfolded. Shots were fired. Promises were made. When the standoff finally ended in May, the warriors laid down their weapons. In return, they were told their grievances would be heard. But long after the barricades fell, the echo of that act, symbolic, desperate, unforgettable, lingered across the nation. The occupation of Wounded Knee was not just a flashpoint. It was a turning point. It drew the nation's attention to the long-ignored plight of Native Americans. From that fire came reform, self-determination acts, new legislation, and renewed federal commitments. The shadows of broken treaties began to lift, if only slightly. Revival in the Lakota heartland. By the late 1990s, the Sioux of South Dakota were no longer just fighting for survival, they were reviving their heritage. Across the reservations, ancestral ceremonies returned with strength. Songs once silenced were sung again. Sacred fires lit the night. Elders passed down stories that had nearly been lost to time. A quiet renaissance took root in the prairie. This was not the end of the struggle. Poverty, underfunding, and systemic barriers remained. But the cultural spirit, the unbreakable core of South Dakota's first people, had stirred again. South Dakota History, Part 4 echoes into the 21st century. Even in the 21st century, South Dakota's past continues to shape its present. Two unresolved struggles haunt the landscape, one rooted in sacred ground, the other in flowing water. The Black Hills, still contested, still sacred. In 1877, the U.S. government seized the Black Hills, land promised to the Sioux under the Treaty of Fort Laramie. A century later, the Supreme Court called the act illegal. It offered money instead of justice. But the Sioux refused. They still do. By the early 2000s, the funds set aside by the federal government to settle the dispute had grown to over $800 million. Yet not a dollar has been touched. For the tribes, this isn't about compensation. It's about restoration. They want the land, not the money. To the Sioux, the Black Hills are not property. They are the heart of a people, the spine of a legacy, the silent witness to betrayal and survival. The Missouri River, a managed force, a mismanaged promise. Meanwhile, the Missouri River, South Dakota's lifeline, remains a source of tension. Under the Flood Control Act of 1944, the river was tamed. 50 dams were built, along with levees and flood walls that transformed its once unruly waters into a controlled system of reservoirs. The price? Hidden beneath the calm surface, centuries-old ecosystems faltered. Native wildlife struggled. Farms in need of irrigation often received too little water, while massive silt deposits clogged the reservoirs. And worse, land was lost. Through the Pixlone Plan, vast swaths of Sioux reservation land were submerged. Thousands of families were displaced. Congress authorized reparations, and in 1999, some land was returned through the Water Resources Development Act. But even now, the full cost of that loss has yet to be measured or repaid. In 2000, the Missouri River Protection and Improvement Act aimed to slow the silt that choked the reservoirs. Still, the damage endures. Some voices argue the river should be allowed to return to its natural rhythm, flood and drought, as it once did for millennia. But such change comes slowly in South Dakota, where the past is never far away. A land between memory and movement. South Dakota in the modern era is not merely defined by politics or population. It is defined by memory, by unresolved agreements, by a river's restrained current and a mountain range that still belongs, in spirit and in truth, to its first guardians. In this land, history is not just remembered, it is lived. Each flood, each lawsuit, each ceremony beneath the Black Hills sky is a continuation of a story that began long before statehood, and that will continue long after. If South Dakota's history has stirred your curiosity, don't stop here. Subscribe to History Love for more deep dives into the untold, the unresolved, and the unforgettable. like comment and share to keep history alive, and to uncover what lies just beneath the surface.